Okay, we're back. Здравствуйте.
Здравствуйте, Jay.
That's Lindsay Hoover. She's with Alchemy Global Capital. This is ThinkTech Talks. We're talking about the status of investment capital in Hawaii. It's a short show. So, first I said Здравствуйте for a good reason, because you have a degree in Russian, which not everybody I know. In fact, you might be the only one who has a degree in Russian. And then you went on further to, spend your time at Monterey, which I have great admiration for.
Yes, I'm a glutton
How
for
can you live with
punishment.
yourself with that kind of background?
Well, then there was the Chinese part, so there are a few missing pieces in the brain that have obviously compelled me to take on some interesting challenges, and perhaps after that, yes, Monterey was my fair and just reward. But I do get over to paradise fairly often, and I love that.
Yeah. So, but how did you get from, say, Russian and Chinese to, and we can talk any one language you like. It's okay. But people, they can use Google and translate.
It's kind of an interesting story, and it's a little bit of a business story. So I wanted to be a diplomat, and my father said, "Oh, great. How about you have a backup plan?" I was studying Russian. I wanted to take Chinese. He made me think I was going to be a teacher. So I said, "Okay, what about I get the MBA and I get to study Chinese after the Russian?" So it was sort of a deal, and it turned out to be, I thought, a useful education for everyone to understand how to balance a checkbook. And I did, in fact, go in the Foreign Service, proving my father a little bit skeptical and perhaps lacking in confidence.
You showed him a few things.
Showed him a few things, and I studied Greek, actually. And I find myself on
the floor.
Yeah, tikanita.
Thank you.
I find myself on the floor of my apartment in Athens with a wonderful view of the Parthenon. Marble floors I used to come home to and dance on every night, alone, of course, unpacking my things, thinking, I need a wife, Jay. I need a wife. Everyone else has a wife. And to make a long story short, I loved my job in the Foreign Service, but I really want to do something more dynamic, more business-oriented. It turns out my dad, something stuck in my mind about that MBA, and I went to Hong Kong. And I did some consulting for a year before the handoff of Hong Kong to China, and it was one of the most dynamic, exciting environments I'd ever been in. People worked from dusk till dawn till dusk, trying to make a living, make a buck, but doing some really interesting things. And it felt like the center of the universe of talent, capital, entrepreneurship, and just a dynamic energy. And I said, I think I want to do this. And I came back to Monterey, and I found a group of people that were starting a boutique investment bank, and I persuaded them to let me join them, perhaps at their peril, because I didn't go away. And it sort of started there, and I continued that path.
Okay. What about Singapore? Why didn't you focus on Singapore? They say that Singapore has even better.
Well, Singapore now, of course, has surpassed, as you probably know, Switzerland in terms of overall wealth under management. But at the time I was there, under Lee Kuan Yew, it was still more the daddy state, a little bit the daddy state.
The caning.
No spinning, which is good. But Hong Kong was very exciting. And actually, it's interesting how this loci of talent, energy, money, and the je ne sais quoi of the center of the universe moves around, right? So I was in Silicon Valley in the late 90s and the early 2000s working with technology companies. And my recent, couple of years ago visit to Shanghai, I felt the same thing. And I would have moved there. Everyone said, you just came here for a week, why don't you stay for a year? But I got the siren song of Carmel Valley and Paradise, maybe another life, maybe the next life.
Wow, what a great story. It just takes off over the map, and it's all the right places. By accident or serendipity or what?
Well, it's a little bit of both, probably.
Yeah, Hong Kong. I went to a function, call it a wedding, in Hong Kong, and gee whiz, actually no, it's in Shanghai, and I go there, and it was a Hawaii kind of event, and gee whiz, they were the guys who were really the movers and shakers in Shanghai. And this is 2008, I think it was. The movers and shakers in Shanghai were from Hong Kong. They were running business in mainland China from Hong Kong. Hong Kong is really unique in that way.
Yeah, and Taiwan has migrated much of their business and capital to China as well. So the long fabled one China may actually be coming to pass.
Yeah. But, it shows me something anyway. It shows me if you go to what did you call the loci? If you go to the right loci, then and it's a moving target, of
Right,
course.
right.
Then you will find like the essence of business. You will find the essence of the human condition financially around the world.
And not only financially, the most exciting part about it really when you're there is the talent. Because the best people in the world go there, right? They're young, they've got the world's their oyster, so where do they choose to go? And that also leads to, of course, a really other interesting scene, right? A nightlife and a cultural scene. So it's really never just about the money, but you do find that where there's opportunity, there's just a lot of talent and a lot of dynamism.
Best people, give me a definition of that.
Gosh.
Smart.
Smart, capable, full of energy, self-confident, but open to learning, and really engaged with the world around them. Not afraid to go to the end of the earth to find out what it's all about.
So why aren't more kids from Hawaii there?
Maybe Hawaii's too nice of a place, Jay. Maybe part of
a tough
Hawaii's
business environment,
challenge
yeah.
is that it's such a wonderful spot to live and grow up, and the atmosphere in terms of the culture and, of course, the physical environment is so wonderful. And I think also people feel very comfortable here, and it's hard to, go out of the nest into the deep, dark world. And in fact, some of the places I've lived in the world aren't necessarily the nicest in terms of the living conditions. Living in a closet in Hong Kong, for example, you might think Hawaii is expensive.
Right.
Try Hong
bucks.
Kong, right? For big bucks, yeah. And it's also a little daunting, I think, for Americans in general, not just Hawaii, to really transplant themselves in a place where they don't speak the language and they may not be comfortable, they don't have a lot of experience. But that's changing. I think Americans and people from Hawaii included are really getting more adventurous in that regard.
So are you living here now?
I spend a week or two, so I nominally live in Carmel Valley. That's not really fair to my husband because I'm only there a week. So Hawaii has equal share with my Carmel Valley share, about a week a month, and the other 2 weeks I'm traveling to usually the East Coast and sometimes overseas. For business, yes.
Not Europe.
I love Europe. Someone send me to Paris. I hope, if anyone's watching out there, you have a job for me in Paris, I'll go tomorrow. I love Europe. I've spent some time in Europe as well. Europe is much more challenged than a place like Hawaii in terms of business because I think there's a culture of very much ingrained sort of an institutional lifestyle in some ways that makes it very difficult for people to hire and fire.
Yeah.
Well, the hiring and firing laws are very stringent, and it really holds a lot of businesses back, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the things I was thinking about when we discussed, the state of capital and investment in the U.S. primarily is what I'm thinking about, is that so many great entrepreneurs from overseas come to America to start businesses, right? And in fact, a statistic I heard recently is that about a third of all successful companies that IPO have at least one non-U.S. founder. I think that's
says something.
A great testament, exactly, to what's possible here and to what might seem like daunting obstacle courses to those of us who are from here.
Bureaucratically speaking.
Are just kind of like a hurdle race for somebody from another country who thinks that what we have to put up with to get a business started and up and running and off the ground is easy. Right.
What about Hong Kong, though? I mean, don't they say, everybody says that Hong Kong is the best business environment in the world? Is it still true?
They have very favorable tax laws, but the Chinese system has been little by little migrating a lot of the things that Hong Kong did to Shanghai in terms of a financial
mainland
center.
Chinese.
Right,
yeah.
the mainland Chinese. So they've been whittling away a little bit at Hong Kong's competitive advantage. And I think the fact that it's no longer under British rule, it's still a very vibrant, important place, but it doesn't have that sense of spotlight for Asia that
it used to have.
It used to, and maybe Shanghai is really
but they
taking
want
more
that,
of that.
Right? They made
position.
Shanghai into a special economic zone.
Right.
And now
it's a little bit like the Switzerland, really, of Asia, right? Everybody
yeah.
can put their money there. Everyone can feel comfortable that it's stable.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a place, it's a safe haven for capital is one way that I would look at it. One of the big advantages it has, in addition to its fantastic food. Of course, it has become a foodie heaven,
Yes.
Singapore.
Yes.
Have you spent time there?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
so you know.
Yes. I want to go back after this discussion. But you have, after all that, with the languages and Monterey and foreign service, what a great, sort of back. Really, I hope you're listening. This is good. After all of that, you come back to the U.S. and you find that the U.S. is actually the best place for investment capital. Hands down.
Hands down.
Wow, but what about all the regulators who don't know anything? What about the bureaucrats who stop everything in their path? You know, what about the people who who don't like capital? What about those people?
People that don't like capital?
People who don't like capital.
Well, there are some, well, let me put it this way. If you don't like capital, you might want to think twice about starting a business. But if you don't like dilution, right? If you don't like venture capital, if you don't like other people getting in your, you know, your sleeping bag with you and telling you what to do, there are more options, right, than there ever were before. In fact, I was thinking about how exciting it is now that people can start businesses on using crowdfunding.
Yeah, sure.
Using social media. There have been lots of talents that have been discovered on YouTube. In fact, most of Hollywood regularly scours YouTube for new comedians, new writers.
Interesting.
I mean, there's a sort of democratization of funding going on, and it's, of course, very competitive, but
what happened to the Securities Act of 1933?
Yeah, where is that Glass-Steagall stuff, right? I'm not sure that we won't see that come back. I actually do some consulting with a bank here, and the regulations that they have to not only work with and implement and enforce, those regulations are changing so often that it requires outsourcing to folks like me, because it's almost impossible for a reasonable sized, $10 billion in asset bank to do business, without life-saving assistance, because the regulators are a little crazy. But that dates back to the great financial crisis, right? And the country's still trying to figure out how to balance letting those institutions, right, and letting financial services and technology, right, this high-speed trading and all of that. I mean, how do you let innovation continue while minimizing the risk?
Let's talk about innovation, because I think that's the core of it. The notes you sent me and, what you're doing these days. Innovation, people say, well, we closed all the factories in this country. We exported manufacturing is what we did. And we have a lot of technology startups in a number of cities, all of whom get billions of dollars of investment capital on a regular basis. The days of March of 2000 are over, and it's robust now, and there's an opportunity for everybody who wants to do that. This is a great country, again, maybe. So you've kind of concluded that, and you've kind of concluded that this is the cloth mother for innovation. Am I right? And this country is really. And so, are we on top? Are we number one? Is anybody at our heels? In China, Alibaba. I mean, $25 billion. That's an IPO to think about. Yeah.
Well, China has the advantage of having what I guess we had after World War II, right, which is a very, very large and very high growth internal market. And I think a lot of very successful innovations and technology companies are going to come out of that. And I think China has an interesting history, the whole revolution in the middle notwithstanding, of really a lot of entrepreneurism, right, and a diaspora around the world that has proven to be extremely adept at innovating and creating businesses. So I think China is interesting. I like to be optimistic and think that Hawaii, for example, is positioned very well.
I want to talk to you about that in depth.
Right, to be at the crossroads of China and the rest of Asia and the U.S. But I still think that we have a culture, an education system, and a melting pot orientation that allows the best kind of cross-pollination, I guess is how I would put it, and collaboration. And that's really one of our strengths. It's not just the free flow of capital and ideas. It's also the fact that America really is a melting pot. And as we know, that's how you get the best food, the prettiest kids. I mean, and Hawaii is a perfect place to be at the forefront of that, especially as Asia becomes a lot more important, I think, in terms of being a new great partner, or a great partner region for the U.S.
But you think we have the special sauce?
I do think we have the special sauce.
And it's a whole combination of things that nobody else in the world has quite the same way.
It's very hard to duplicate. It's very hard to duplicate.
Yeah.
It's educational, it's institutional, it's cultural to the greatest degree. And yeah, we are moving manufacturing jobs overseas, but I keep reading stories about digital printing. And I think that it will be a situation where you move up the food chain, and I think we were talking earlier, Jay, about software eating the world, right? You don't necessarily need factories to create software, although software runs probably every factory and everything else that we do. And I think we're very good here at that. China is good at that as well. After having studied Chinese, I guess I have a little secret for you about why I think that's the case.
Oh, I'm interested.
Chinese and I suppose other languages that have that many characters, you have to start with memorization. Memorization.
In school.
Right, creativity and the question that has 1,000
Second.
answers comes pretty late in that educational system.
Yeah.
Partly because of the requirement to learn language, and of course for many years there were very few literate people in China because of the challenge of learning Chinese.
Yeah.
And they also have a saying that the nail that rises up gets hammered down.
I thought that was a Hawaii saying.
Came from
It
China.
Came from China, yeah.
So now that's changing dynamically, right? But those are things that take maybe more than a couple decades to overcome.
Yeah. So for the moment, we still have what it takes. I mean, and that seems to be more evident in Silicon Valley than other places in the country. Although, I mean, I'm happy to hear that New York and what's the name of that neighborhood in New York is so successful.
You're talking about it's Silicon Alley.
Silicon Alley, and all
Alley,
that,
right?
Yeah. So I'm happy to hear that because I mean I think there's a lot of vitality in New York, but there's not as much capital in New York for this as there is in Silicon Valley.
Well, so just a few statistics for the second quarter. PwC does a money tree survey every quarter about the venture capital investment in the U.S.
That's PricewaterhouseCoopers. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's a great source of information and data because every time I take a look at that, I learn so much because the data really does tell a story. And you say, are we really on top? Well, we are back to, let's see, 13 billion in venture capital was invested just in the second quarter of this year. And I read the survey at the end of last year, and people were wringing their hands and gnashing their teeth. But 13 billion just in the second quarter, which takes us back to about the high water mark of 2000 on an annualized basis.
We were going nuts then.
We were going nuts then. But the companies that are getting money now, as you see the companies that are IPOing, generally have revenues. Some of them are even profitable. Now, there are exceptions, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but I think that also speaks to American innovation.
And there are fewer venture capitalists now.
Yes, there are about half as many as there were in 2000. There were about 500 down from 1,000, and those firms have thinned the ranks of professionals by 2/3 to about 5,000 people from 15,000.
Why? Did they get dinged in 2000?
There were too many people that wanted to be venture capitalists because it was such a hot and frothy market, and it's consolidated.
And
like
it's not easy either. You got to be the talented crowd.
And of that 500, 30 firms accounted for half of all the deals, and only 40 of those firms manage $1 billion or more. So there could be more consolidation. And the same things happened later on in the food chain with private equity. But so, to the story. So Silicon Valley companies got about 7 billion of that 13 billion. Mm-hmm. And the next couple regions that followed, which were New York and New England, each got about 1 billion. So it's kind of, not winner take all, but Silicon Valley definitely has a disproportionate share.
Why?
Why?
Because these other places have a lot of vitality.
There are lots of smart people that have their
great
theories,
universities.
Right?
They're crucibles.
Well, Silicon Valley, to be fair, had an edge in terms of a lead,
historically.
Right? Yeah, historically with Fairchild Semiconductor and some of the big hardware companies, they were perfectly positioned, and also with great universities like Stanford and Berkeley and the other ones throughout the state, to be at the forefront of that development of software. And so I think they really had an unfair edge, so to speak. California also is notoriously receptive to new ideas, innovation, new people, immigrants. I look at sort of what I would consider, although New York technically is slightly ahead of the Boston area, again, New York has a little bit of an unfair cultural advantage, right? It's a huge melting pot, very open to
Talk about international influence.
Exactly.
Wow. Yeah.
But the Boston area is kind of the most impressive in that it's notoriously traditional, but they have invested in infrastructure. They have great universities. They have great institutions. They're very welcoming to Fortune 1000 companies. So they have the right ingredients of state and federal funding, private funding, corporate partnerships and collaboration, and attracting the best minds and talent. And then they've taken that and they've pushed it and pushed it. Yeah. And I think they're going to give Silicon Valley, to the extent anyone can, a pretty big run for its money.
And that's a moving target. That's a relatively recent kind of arising. And the universities are, my God, the prestige is incredible. And once you play that card, you can bring people in from everywhere.
Exactly. And as
So-
Peter Thiel has notoriously said in California, right, if you attract people to universities there, he's urging you to quit when you get there and start a business, but it's true that that kind of opportunity, like we said, kind of the eye of the hurricane, the loci, that attracts people. And the other interesting thing about Silicon Valley is it's sort of like the network effect. People talk about that in terms of eBay and Google, right? Once you get a certain critical mass of users, more and more people want to come onto your platform, like
Yeah.
Facebook.
Yeah.
I think of Silicon Valley exactly as that. I mean, the more people that came, the more talent that came, companies were created, wealth was created, those people started second companies that attracted more talent, and it kind of feeds on itself until the real estate gets so expensive that everyone has to live in boats off the
Real estate's
harbor,
part
right?
of the mixture.
It's part of the mixture. And it's also that interesting, I think about it as, I'm going to, if my brother-in-law has an idea for a business, I'm probably inclined to listen, right? So one of the challenges for Hawaii is, there aren't enough venture capitalists here to meet around the water cooler or at the pickup basketball game or at your daughter's soccer game. And if you're in Silicon Valley, you're going to bump into those people at a higher rate.
So I should, if I want to be in on this, either as this would be hard, but a venture capitalist or as an entrepreneur, I got to pick up and go there. I got to go to school there or take my degree and go there. I got to get involved in that social crowd, if you will. I got to find a job. I can sweep the floor. I just got to be
Like the creative artist agency, right? You get a job in the mailroom in Hollywood, but it's somewhat true. Proximity is important. I think Hawaii is trying to bridge that oceanic gap, if you will, in some interesting ways.
Well, you remember Act 221.
I do.
Now that seemed like a good idea at the time, but to others and people in power, it seemed like a terrible idea. So they fought with it for 10 years and made it go away, and it went away. And then there was a vacuum, and
Right.
that vacuum persists.
Right. Well, I'm sort of the view that government probably doesn't always know the best direction to lead business.
When did you first find this out?
Would have been in the Foreign Service probably when I said, I think I better work for the private sector. But, I think that Act 221 actually was a noble effort, if you will, to jumpstart some things in Hawaii. It did have some good effects.
I agree.
And tax incentives will do that. But it takes so much more than that. It takes the successful people in Hawaii. It takes the private sector. One of the bigger challenges for Hawaii is that the largest industries here aren't the easiest necessarily to work with in terms of venture funding. You have the defense sector, which we should talk about a little bit, because while it's not necessarily viewed as a private enterprise that can foster innovation,
No, but
in
dual
many
use
ways,
is a big deal.
in many ways it has, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think of all these people taking credit for inventing the internet, but I think without DARPA, it probably wouldn't have happened, right?
True.
There are some very interesting companies in Hawaii that were started with government grants and Defense Department grants. And I think that to kind of segue for a minute into what are opportunities for Hawaii, with software, as we talked about, being something where you don't have to have the factory here, and with cloud computing and the strength of bandwidth and end devices now kind of melding to create so much more opportunity on a software and small device front, that's an area where Hawaii could really excel. And the Defense Department is a perfect testing ground and partner in the areas of big data, data mining and predictive analytics
Big
and
equipment,
cybersecurity.
big everything, enterprise level.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they have the kind of funding and interest in advancing those areas. And that's where Hawaii needs to be opportunistic, in addition to maybe going to school in the mainland and coming back, much as people in mainland China have done, right? They've come to the U.S. to get university education.
Are they incentivized to come back?
I think they're culturally incentivized to come back. I don't know that they're particularly financially incentivized.
I remember reading about a guy who was involved in biotech in New Jersey, and he had a PhD, and he worked for a biotech company, and the Chinese, this is maybe 8 or 10 years ago, the Chinese said, look, come back, we'll give you your own company, we'll give you your own laboratory, you can do anything you want, we'll make you a king. and he came back, and he wasn't the only one.
Right, right.
And that kind of incentive is irresistible, especially if you have the cultural incentive that helps you along. You can't lose.
Right, the government has a lot more pennies to give. And think of it, too, it's a tabula rasa, right? I mean, if they're growing at the rate that we were after World War II, that would be an incentive for any entrepreneur, Chinese or otherwise.
So in Hawaii, you know, we haven't done as well as we might have. We haven't done as well as the draftsman of Act 221 thought, you know, 15 years ago. We've seemed to spew our people away rather than allow for them to come together and, you know, create what we call intellectual concentrations for tech. And we have right now, you can argue with me on this, we have right now really a very small tech industry, not enough to reach critical mass, and it's clear from what you've been saying that critical mass is what you need. You need a community of that intellectual concentration and capital, both. We don't have either one in, you know, sufficient quantity to say we have critical mass. So we are, in my view, way behind, and we need to catch up, and the government is not doing anything. And I agree with you also that dual use and defense is a very important element, and maybe the most active element in our future. But gee whiz, if we wanted to have a serious competitive tech industry, we have a long way to go. And the question I put to you is, where do we start?
Well, I think there are some efforts being made in that regard right now. Between the funding of startup ventures, blue startups, some of these areas that are working with the state and some federal funding is at least the seed, right, of the future. And I think that some of those groups that are really that understand how Silicon Valley works and understand the kind of network effect and critical mass you need here are trying to attract talented people to Hawaii. Not just advance the homegrown talent, which is important, but get that mix going, that sort of interplay and cross-pollination that we talked about. And even if those people come here and they leave Hawaii, they're going to be planting seeds like birds, right? They're going to be dropping pollen, they're going to be seeding ideas. There may be some back and forth that happens for a while before much of that takes root in Hawaii. I think if you look at Silicon Valley, and Boston may be even a better example, right? Because it didn't have the kind of serendipitous historic lead that Silicon Valley had. They're focusing on areas where they have an industry domain expertise, and biotech and medical devices are second after Silicon Valley in terms of the funding amount that is generated for them, $2.5 billion out of that 13 billion that I mentioned. And New England, you know, has really focused on being competitive in that area. And Hawaii has some pretty good, between Queens and between HMSA and some of the institutions that are here, I think there are opportunities, and the University of Hawaii, of course, with their fund, to build areas of expertise, domain expertise, that will then attract the best talent.
Example?
Well, I think that, for example,
biotech,
there are some interesting demographic characteristics to the populations here that would enable you to test and perhaps develop treatments for things like diabetes or cardiovascular disease or certain kinds of diseases where you have a little bit of a lab effect here. And we talked about the Defense Department, which really bleeds into software, big data, data mining, predictive analytics. And also, the energy sector is an interesting one for Hawaii because the cost of energy here is high and the sources of energy are diverse. So it could potentially serve as a bit of a laboratory for integrating those different sources of energy into a model that can enable others around the world, including China, which again could be a big partner and an investor in some of these ventures because they have some big challenges. So Hawaii could potentially lead the way, and I think picking your spots is important.
Well, I think you've got to have a sort of a cloth mother too. You mentioned two organizations. Well, you mentioned one, and then you referred obliquely to the other one. Blue Startups,
right,
brings in a fair percentage, if not more than half, of their startups from the mainland.
Right.
In fact, they're doing a program, East-West.
Right, exactly, East-West. Right.
Which is all about Hong Kong, you know. And so you're right. I mean, it seeds, it fertilizes the thought process. And then we have the Energy Accelerator with Dawn Lippert, who is really very good. And a fair percentage, if not more than half, of their entrepreneurs come from the mainland.
Right.
And I say, this is good because it creates that seeding process you describe, and it sort of stirs things up and gives a better intellectual process,
Right.
more
Right.
innovation.
Oxygen.
But wouldn't it be better if they stayed here?
It'd be great if they stayed here, but you have to let things develop organically. And I think the biggest single challenge to businesses staying here is the skill set and the talent base that goes across the range of things that are needed for a successful startup. Let's take a software startup, right? You need graphic design, you need engineering, software design, you might need integration with hardware, you're going to need potentially a social media expert, right? Social marketing, viral marketing. You might ultimately also need something like optics, depending on the way things are going. So I think that should really be the goal, is how do we build a diverse skills base here in Hawaii, and the educational system here could take a role in that, so that if a company comes here and they love it, which of course they're going to love it, they don't feel that they have to leave to get the kind of talent that they need. And I know there are some initiatives here to really advance STEM and robotics, and I think those are fantastic ideas for Hawaii, because to the extent you have those capabilities here, there's no reason a great company wouldn't want to stay here. Now, I think they're going to have to travel, meet the next stage of the food chain. There's a company that I know very well that I worked with called TrueTags, and TrueTags is a nanoporous, particulate security company targeting the pharma business, because it's part of Sky Ventures. Because they have an edible security barcode, if you will, but also any kind of high-value item. And I think in some ways what they're doing is very emblematic of what other Hawaii companies can do. They were founded in Hawaii. They elected to set up their manufacturing in Hawaii, but they have software and certain other design elements in Silicon Valley. And they have crisscrossed the globe to meet corporate partners and customers. And I can't emphasize that enough. That's another challenge for Hawaii companies, is how do you get close to the customer? I mean, you really can't do it all over email and Skype. You really have to pound the pavement, and you have to understand the customer requirements and not just build what's really cool. You can build cool apps and make a small business, but enduring companies understand their customers, and they get that feedback all the time. And then they also, just to finish that thought, they have obtained investment from the US and China. And yet they're here in Hawaii. Now that'd be a great, roadmap to follow. It's not easy. It takes great people, and it does take people that also actually love Hawaii, or they probably would have, gone somewhere else. So I think it's possible.
Well, can you comment on the InMobi model? I don't know if you know InMobi. Kevin Hughes, who made money in Silicon Valley, and then he lost money in Silicon Valley around 2000, that period of time, and he came back and he got involved in a number of ventures here. He was at Manoa Innovation Center for a while. And last time I followed him, he was involved in a company called InMobi, INMOBI, and they did impressions, social media impressions around the world. And they were, acquired is the wrong word, but they were in a partnership with an Indian company, and they had people really all over the world. And every morning, Kevin would wake up and they would get on a conference call that stretched around the globe. And they had these great minds everywhere. And it struck me that, this is the model of the future, that you have a company with people everywhere who can appreciate the market everywhere, who can take the best talent from everywhere and capital, I suppose. And they're without borders. They're universal. Isn't that the future, don't you think, Lindsay? What do you think?
Well, Hollywood is actually leading the way a little bit in that direction. The creative businesses of animation, and to some degree all of these special effects, that stuff happens all around the world on a 24/7 basis. I think there might need to be a central brain and maybe some critical mass in a location of people who are deciding and working on the strategic direction of a company. But I do think that looking around the globe and actively engaging the best talent from where it resides and allowing it to stay there, because maybe it makes sense for software engineers to be in Hyderabad and for creative folks to be in Japan of a certain ilk.
And factories to be in China.
In fact, well, or ultimately they may migrate, of course, because that cost is probably going to go up. I think some people believe that eventually we're going to have a leveling of talent and pay across the world, and I think we would all hope for something like that to happen.
Globalism.
But it's funny how different places have different characters and different personalities. A place has a personality that impacts the personalities of the people that live there. And it begets certain kinds of industries and
that's your
talents.
point about Hawaii, which has something special. The U.S. has something special, the melting pot,
Right.
but Hawaii has more like a super melting pot.
Right.
We understand this kind of collaborative process better, perhaps, than anywhere, and it's an asset which we have to play.
Right.
And so, okay, so how do we play it? I asked you before, what do we do to keep them here? Because if they stay here, the people from elsewhere stay here. Wow, we're a long way further down the road toward critical mass.
Or how about we attract people who aren't from here and get them to come here?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
This is the first year that visas have been wholly engaged under the EB-5 program, right? Which allows investors coming to the U.S. to invest either $500,000 or $1 million, depending on the area, and they can get a green card and their kids can study here. I've been exploring the idea that, hey, Hawaii should be a magnet for this kind of investment, because people from Asia who are taking up most of these visas, it's people from China in the last year or two, feel very comfortable here. It's a comfortable gateway to go to the U.S. and bring some of that dynamism and entrepreneurism and capital to Hawaii. And there's a program, a regional investment center program, that allows them to be the conduit for the capital but not have to run a business if they don't have that experience. I think, if Hawaii positions itself appropriately as a business destination, as a business creation and innovation destination, it's not just about the people that are from here. It's about all the people that come here on vacation, right, that would love to live here and have a thriving business community and make their living here.
EB-5 has not been all that successful here. In fact, I don't think there are many cases.
There aren't. There's actually no successful cases. But part of the reason for that, I believe, is that the people that have started these entities, in some cases, haven't fully appreciated what's needed in terms of government documentation, and some of them have not been from Hawaii. And it's kind of hard to do business in Hawaii if you're not from Hawaii.
They don't understand the process, the essential process.
And the other thing that Hawaii has as a challenge, a nascent challenge, is when you go to a place like Boston or Silicon Valley, you have so many large employers, right? Large corporations, large customers, large partners, and large investors. And that's how to overcome that, I'm not quite sure. That's why I talk about the government as a partner here in Hawaii, the medical industry as a partner here in Hawaii. We have to look to the partners we have and try to leverage them for all they're worth.
Yeah, for sort of a social look at this, a community networking, knitting together look, what's happened in these other centers? How do we do that here? Because, we have a government right now, I think, that can talk the game but doesn't do the game. We have some small examples of startup, guys like Hank Rogers, who puts it together, who makes an organization, makes it happen. The same thing with Dawn Lippert and Hawaii Energy Accelerator. But how do we have not two, but like dozens of those? Because I think that if we had dozens of those, we'd be on the road to critical mass. I mean, how do you achieve that? Do you do that with incentives, or do you just write them a nice note and say, please? What do you do?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, can government lead industry? Not necessarily, but look at the bidding that took place for the battery factory for Tesla, right? Ultimately, it did come down to incentives, and it did come down to the cost of labor, and it did come down to how friendly the state is going to be, and I think that's going to play an increasing role in businesses deciding where to locate in the future.
Sure, like movies. It's just like movies.
It's just like movies, right?
If you give them incentives, they will come for sure.
Exactly, and that's a partnership again. None of these places that have been very, very successful, like Silicon Valley, like Boston, like Raleigh-Durham, they've done an incredible job. It's a partnership, and it's a thoughtful, strategic partnership, not one where each does their own thing and tries to hope they come together. I think there's a lot of communication and interaction between business, educational institutions, and state and hopefully federal government, but more importantly, state and local government, to make these communities blossom.
What's interesting is that although this was a campaign issue 4 years ago for Neil Abercrombie, and he directed a huge amount of rhetoric on how he was going to build a tech industry. It isn't a campaign issue this year, for some reason. I mean, it's just maybe lip service, but it isn't really a campaign issue. And so I wonder where it follows, whether this is going to be, an administration to follow now that's going to be excited about this, or maybe not. Because I think that you have to have leadership in this area, such as there has been in all these other centers you described.
And in fact, the new PM of India, right? I mean, he was elected on a platform of making it easier for business to get done. So
Modi.
It's important all over the world, not just in Hawaii, and it's a challenge all over the world.
Yeah. Okay, well, the other thing is there venture capital in Hawaii? I mean, people have been, David Watermo taught me, Mr.
I know of him,
Biotech.
yes.
Okay, what's this? Cardex Pharmaceutical, which is a spin-off from Hawaii Biotech back when. So he always said, in order to do technology in any area, you have to have capital. No capital, no technology. It's high leverage. You have to have money to spend to hire talent and all that. So is there venture capital here? Is there investment capital? What do I need to do to get it? They're all waiting for your answer, Lindsay.
I don't think at this point that there is enough venture capital in Hawaii. How do you get that capital here? There are some funds, and I think we've talked about some of them. There are actually some visiting funds that I've encountered that come to Hawaii, some of whom have been invested in by the institutional investors of Hawaii. And as part of that deal, so to speak, they are supposed to come to Hawaii periodically and see if there are appropriate investments for them.
This is the employees' retirement system and all that?
Folks like that.
And Kamehameha schools,
exactly.
I think, yeah.
And there are some very large and successful venture funds that are beneficiaries of those investments, and they do come here, and I think they diligently search for opportunities.
They have to find them, though.
The challenge that they have is they are a little bit later stage, larger scale types of funds, looking for bigger opportunities than I think they have found in Hawaii in terms of how large they think a company can become. But if blue startups and those types of ventures continue to seed companies here in Hawaii and elsewhere and continue to look for startups and foster them with a kind of mentorship and good old business and financial advice, right, that every kid starting a business probably needs to hear.
Sure.
You have to hope that sooner or later, like in the case of True Tags, right? True Tags has institutional investment.
It's a great idea.
It's a great idea, but it takes maybe it takes the Hawaii village, right, to build these companies.
Yes.
But I think it's just a matter of not giving up and being attuned to what it really is a food chain. So even if you have venture investment in Hawaii, and there's no follow-on investment or later stage people looking at companies here, they're going to die on the vine or they're going to have to leave.
Yeah.
So those companies that have a chance of being successful in Hawaii, they have to proactively get on the airplane and rack up the miles, visit investors, visit customers, make sure that your prospective investors and your board and whoever you're working with know that you'll go wherever you have to go, to make it happen. And the fact that you're in Hawaii isn't just a lifestyle choice, right? It's perhaps a business choice.
Yeah. Well, something really interesting you said in your notes about, so we're 2,500 miles from Silicon Valley. That means we can fly there in whatever it is, 5 hours.
Right.
And that's a good thing. But it also means they got to fly here. It takes them 5 hours.
Right.
Which is kind of a hassle for them.
Well, and it's living in California isn't the worst thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe if we were offshore from a less attractive destination, you would have, and you do have a fair number of what I call second home money. You've got a lot of venture capitalists and successful entrepreneurs who have second homes here, and I find that many of them, or this might just be my impression, they look at Hawaii as a place for them to exercise their philanthropic instincts. And that's wonderful. And this trend towards social investing could really have real benefits for Hawaii too, because I think Hawaii has a kind of a special dimension about safeguarding the better things in life and a certain spiritual aspect to life.
Yeah.
So how about if those philanthropic entrepreneurs, when they talk about the triple bottom line, they also focus on the top line and make sure that when they're looking at philanthropic investing, they're really focusing on building the future of Hawaii, not just an insular future, but an outward-looking future that will enable Hawaii to be very successful so that, as you say, the people here don't have to leave to make a great living or a great business. And I think their experience, more than their money, their experience and their knowledge of how things work, maybe being a little bit tough love is really what
Yes.
could benefit
I think
Hawaii.
that would be great. But you know what? I ran into a venture capitalist, I mean, who has done very well over a long time in Silicon Valley with money to invest, and he has, you know, it's the money from the first project that goes in, investment in the second and so forth. And he came out here and did a survey of, talked to everybody he could find. And at the end of the day, he concluded that the best place to invest money, you're going to be sad. Are you sitting down?
I'm sitting down, I think.
The best place to invest money in Hawaii was in the hospitality industry, which is, you know, it's backbone of the economy.
Right? It's a big industry
sure,
here.
but it's not tech.
It's not tech.
And it's not going to generate tech jobs,
No.
and it's not going to have all that leverage and draw young people and all that stuff. And so it's a reputational thing, but it's also, you know, he was making an analysis.
Right.
This was not a loose decision. He spent weeks talking to everyone.
There's a big infrastructure that supports that business, right? You have everything in the talent chain. You have the management, you have the reasonably cost labor, very hospitable group of people that live here and work here. You need to create that for technology. And I do believe that software, because of its you can distribute it anywhere. The marginal cost of the second unit is zero. I ran into an entrepreneur at LAX, software guy who's selling to enterprises, and he said, yeah, I bootstrapped my company. I didn't need any venture investing. It was his second company. I said, well, how are you doing that? He said, I do all my advertising on Google search. He doesn't even have a sales force. So the world is evolving to a place where Hawaii, and Hank Rogers actually gave a talk on this a couple years ago at a venture capital event here, and it really is Hawaii's opportunity. You know, the fact that it's expensive here, that energy costs, it doesn't matter, right? It's all about making software that's compelling, and it can be working with big data or government, it can be working with the medical industry, it could be working with the tourism industry. But that's what venture capitalists want to invest in most. They want capital intensity low, scalability high, time to liquidity short, ROI potential enormous.
What you call
right?
a light on capital, capital light.
Right, capital light, scalable, and fast tracking.
Yeah.
And in fact, I wasn't going to tell you this, Jay.
But
are you
now
sitting
that we're
down?
together.
Are you sitting down? A couple of years ago, as I was looking at these incubator-type funds that the state of Hawaii was considering investing in with federal funds to back them, I did a little bit of research on what might be effective, and I looked into the National Venture Capital Association's database, and I came to a very sad conclusion, which was if I was a pure financial investor with no philanthropic bent and no domain expertise and no knowledge about what might work and what might not work, maybe like your friend, and I looked at returns over the last 10 years, consistently, almost every year, in fact, I think every year for the last 10 years, I would conclude that software, and specifically internet-oriented or internet, software would be the only place to put money, because from a returns basis, it has been not only ahead, but leaps and bounds ahead of every other sector for the last 10 years. And there's no reason to imagine that it's not going to stay there with some blips for the next 10 years.
So that means that the young fellow or girl who wants to get in on this and take advantage of the cloth mother we've been describing in this country and potentially also in Hawaii should go into software. But let me ask you, a lot of the software entrepreneurs I know, my last question, a lot of the software entrepreneurs I know, and which are funded by these startup organizations, are doing little tiny programs on cell phones.
Right.
With very little, you know, like Lyft
apps
and Uber, and like that, which could be ultimately very successful, but they're long shots at the beginning.
Right.
And the idea is, well, you do something wild and crazy like that, and maybe you hit it. Maybe one out of 10,000 entrepreneurs hits one that actually catches like wildfire.
Right.
Is this the right thing? Is this software as you see it, or as they see it, or are we really talking about software on some other level?
Well, I sort of think, like we said earlier, if you build apps, maybe you can build a good investment thesis for the short term, but if you build customer innovation, you build companies. And I think customer innovation is really the heart of all of this. And that's another lesson I think we've talked about, which is if you live in Hawaii, find a way to get close to your customers, what you think your market is. I think it'd be great to build something lasting, right, that can employ hundreds of people and not 2 people in the garage. And Big data, predictive analytics, those are going to be very, very big software plays. And nothing wrong with making your first 25 million on an app when you're a kid, but if you are that kid, invest it in something bigger.
Yeah, great, wonderful. That is a perfect place to close our discussion. Thank you
It's
so
been
much.
fun, Jay.
Yes. Lindsay
Thanks
Hoover,
for the opportunity.
Alchemy Global Capital, thank you so much for spending time with me.
My pleasure.
Aloha and
Aloha.
do svidaniya.
До свидания. Всего хорошего.